Chapter 5. Elsa peered down at the 3 ships docked in her harbor. There was a twinge of relief at seeing them, the release of tension which had built up in her neck and shoulders, and for the first time in a long time she felt like smiling. They hadn't received a ship which carried with it good news, not for a long while, and it made her realize how much she missed this. Arendelle had always been a vibrant kingdom busy with trade, and it wasn't uncommon to look out over the fjord at any given time and see the brown dot of an approaching vessel. As a child, she always looked forward to these visits, for it usually meant a new gift from her father. In the evening, just after supper, he'd call her and Anna to him and present them with something he'd received from the traveling merchants, a toy or a treat or some exotic contraption that would fill them with wonder. That sense of anticipation carried on into adulthood, and after becoming queen she still looked forward to these visits. Until the drought, that is. After the drought, these merchants lost most of their luster, becoming a necessary evil as they dismantled Arendelle bit by bit in return for the most basic of needs. They'd left her empty and hopeless, and she'd lost the joy she once knew. So now she was happy to feel the tickle of excitement again as she wondered what John and his men had delivered. The ships were large, larger than most that frequented Arendelle. They had tall masts bearing multiple sails, stretched out like the untouched canvas of some giant artist. The decks were set high above the water, with the bottoms sinking deep beneath the surface of the fjord, meaning lots of room for cargo. It was hard to imagine that each of these ships were full of supplies. Full. She tried to guess how many barrels and crates could be hidden within the belly of those massive beasts, and she shook her head at the impossibility of it. But she had little time to dwell on this. As her eyes strayed from the ships to the dock, she noticed the guards there were taut with suspicion, standing in a protective line, hands on sword hilts. Like a bear trap, the slightest pressure could release them. "Alec," she said, "please take your men and help unload those ships." "Yes, Your Majesty," Alec said, motioning for one of the guards to follow as he left the room. After they'd gone, John stepped forward. "Thank you, Your Mad," he interrupted himself as he put his gloves back on. "Thank you, Elsa." This man had sailed 3 ships across the vast reaches of the sea to deliver a gift, and he was thanking her? "It's the least I can do," she said, and for the first time she really looked at him, studying him with an eye she lacked until that moment. When he arrived, he'd been an unknown, a potential threat, a man not to be trusted, and she hadn't been looking at him so much as through him, trying to find the layer of deceit she was sure must lay hidden beneath his official presentation. But now that was gone, and she was able to examine him without prejudice. He was a handsome man, that was true enough, ruddy in appearance with thick auburn hair and steel blue eyes, a strong chin, and a square jawline that framed a welcoming smile. Although there was a resemblance to his brother, sharing many of his physical traits, he no longer reminded her of Hans. John's generosity set him so far apart from his disgraced brother, it was hard to imagine they were members of the same family. A quiet settled over the room as Elsa was lost in her thoughts, and she only became aware she was staring when John cleared his throat in a somewhat nervous fashion. "Well, there's lots of work to be done. We might as well get to it." He and his companions bowed before leaving through the archway. Anna waited until their footsteps shrank into silence, and then she said, "Oh my goodness! I can't believe it! See, I told you it would work out, didn't I?" She was excited, Elsa thought, and who could blame her? She'd been correct in her prediction, after all. At long last they had some relief from their suffering, a temporary reprieve from the feeling of impending doom. "And did you see the way he looked at you?" Anna said, nudging Elsa with her elbow. She hadn't paid attention to that, hadn't thought about it until just now. She was too preoccupied with the infusion of goods to be focused on the man who delivered them, but now that Anna mentioned it, maybe there was something to her observation. Perhaps his gaze had lingered a little longer than royal etiquette would prescribe. It was kind of exciting, though, when she thought about it, a handsome prince whose gaze lingered a bit too long. "No, I didn't notice anything," Elsa said. Kristoff joined Olaf by the window to watch the men below. He had a stern look of disapproval, but neither Elsa nor Anna noticed this. Therefore, they were both surprised when Kristoff, still looking out the window, said, "We can't trust him, you know." Elsa meant to object, but Anna beat her to it. "Kristoff, what are you talking about?" He gave Anna a look. It was one Elsa had seen many times, the look of a man who thought his conclusion was obvious and was unable to understand how anyone else could miss it. He and Anna had differed on many viewpoints over the past year or so, and the subject of trusting people was no exception. He'd often said Anna needed to be more wary of strangers, especially those whose motives are unclear, and she shouldn't allow anyone to get too close until they could prove themselves trustworthy. During these conversations, Kristoff never mentioned Hans, but no doubt he considered that the foremost example which supported his argument. Anna countered that you can't go around mistrusting everyone just because there are a few bad apples out there. They tried to drag Elsa into this argument on more than one occasion, but she had no desire to arbitrate their discussions. Personally, she found the truth to be somewhere in the middle, between trusting nobody and trusting everybody, but she kept that to herself. "Anna," Kristoff said, "since when do we trust any prince from the Southern Isles?" "That's not fair," Anna said, crossing her arms. "Prince John is not Hans." "I didn't say he was, but I think we can all agree you're not the best judge of character here." Anna looked like she was fumbling for a reply, but no words came out of her mouth. Elsa could honestly say this was the first time she'd ever seen her sister speechless. Kristoff gave her an apologetic shrug. "I'm sorry. I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. That's just the way it is." Anna turned to Elsa, hands on hips, expecting her to come to her defense, to help refute Kristoff's accusation. Whether true or not, though, she wasn't going to let herself be dragged into this argument either. "What?" Elsa said, feigning ignorance. "Tell him we can trust John." Elsa could feel her neutrality being whittled away as they waited for her response, but she was in no hurry to take sides. When you dug down and got beneath all the strong feelings and preconceived notions, she could see they both had a somewhat valid point. On the one hand, none of them really knew anything about John, having just met him, but on the other hand, simply being a brother of Hans was no reason to cast him off. She wasn't sure what to think or whose side to choose, so she didn't say anything. "Elsa," Kristoff said, "think about it. This guy arrives out of the blue from who knows where to supposedly rescue your kingdom. But we don't know anything about him. He could be anyone from anywhere. Have you thought about that? Who's to say he's even from the Southern Isles? Even if he is who he says he is, if he's Hans' brother, then that's even more reason not to trust him." This was something she hadn't really considered. Could there be any truth to Kristoff's words? If so, then Arendelle could be in grave danger, but she found it difficult to imagine someone intent on doing harm to her kingdom would go so far out of their way to help save it. "I don't see any reason not to trust him. He didn't have to bring all of this food and water." Kristoff shook his head. "Have you so quickly forgotten what Hans did in Arendelle? Of course not." She resented the accusation. The protection of her kingdom and her people was her foremost concern, her very reason for existence, and to suggest she was some gullible fool who could be tricked into jeopardizing Arendelle stirred her anger. Kristoff must have detected this, for he softened his tone. "Think about it. Hans took care of the people of Arendelle and even saved you from the Duke's men, but his plan all along was to kill both you and Anna and steal the throne. If this man is who he says he is, then he's a brother of Hans, and who's to say he's not here to do the same thing?" There was more truth to Kristoff's words than she cared to admit. Hans had fooled everyone with his charade, gaining everyone's trust, including her own. She recalled the last thing she'd said to him just before he revealed his true intentions. "Take care of my sister," she'd asked him. She shut her eyes, trying to will away the pain of the memory. She asked a murderous traitor to take care of Anna, a man who'd already locked her in a room, leaving her to freeze to death. That had been a mistake, but was Kristoff's reasoning sound? Could she be making the same mistake here? There was cause for caution, no doubt, but they had no good reason to think John was here to do anyone harm, and she wouldn't begin to mistrust him until she had a sound reason to do so. Being related to Hans wasn't enough, not after such an incredible display of kindness and generosity. "I understand your concern, but I won't repay kindness with accusations and suspicion. Until I have a good reason to believe otherwise, Prince John will remain a friend of Arundel, and we will all treat him as such. Is that understood?" Kristoff wouldn't be so easily convinced, she knew that, but she was surprised at how disappointed he looked. "Please, Elsa, I don't want you to get hurt." His resistance to her command didn't anger her. Kristoff's intentions were good, she knew that, but he also had a penchant for mistrusting anyone who didn't come within his small circle of friends. "As I said, I appreciate your concern, but I don't have the luxury of mistrusting every stranger who comes to Arundel to offer help." She could tell he hadn't accepted her conclusion, but would he abide by it? They'd never disagreed on an issue this serious before. He looked like he had something else to say, but he must have changed his mind because he headed for the exit. "I'm going to help unload the ships." It was a statement which didn't invite a response, and no one offered a reply. The excitement was gone, as if sucked out of the room. "Wait for me!" Olaf cried out, hurrying after him. Elsa went to the window and Anna joined her, watching as the men prepared the ships for unloading. Many of Alec's guards joined John's men, and they scurried about the docks, opening large two-doored hatches that led down to the bellies of the ships. The barrels were lifted through these hatches, secured by a rope and pulley system, then loaded onto carts to be transferred to the cellar of the castle. A line of men ferried them like a parade of marching ants, some leaving with a full cart and others returning for more over and over again, and yet the stream of containers never seemed to end. Elsa wondered how long such an enormous infusion of goods could last and how much time they'd give her to find her own water, but the numbers defied calculation. How had this happened? How had this man just appeared out of thin air and offered 3 ships full of supplies without a thought of compensation for his trouble? It must have taken a tremendous amount of work to load those ships, and what's more, sailing could be a dangerous occupation. After all, her own parents were killed when their ship went down at sea over 4 years ago. So what kind of man goes through all that trouble and takes that much risk without a thought for himself? Could he have ulterior motives? It was a question she didn't like asking, as if contemplating such suspicion were in itself a sign of ingratitude, but it had to be considered. It was her job to consider it. She was grateful for such a wonderful gift, but still, Kristoff had planted a seed of doubt, and she couldn't uproot it. It took considerable effort to turn her thoughts away from this, but she did. Until they had more evidence, well, any evidence, really, she wouldn't dwell on such misgivings. The girls remained at the window for most of the morning before breaking away to care for other duties. Elsa conferred with her staff to prepare rooms for John and his men, and it was decided the mostly empty guards' barracks would be best suited to accommodate them. While Elsa worked with the castle staff to prepare these quarters, Anna joined the other servants in putting together a simple meal for the unexpected guests. It was served in the courtyard at noon, after which the men returned to their work. In the late afternoon, Elsa and Anna returned to the throne room to watch again. The sun was completing its daily march toward the fjord, and the shadows of the masts were growing longer as they stretched across the dock. By this time, Alec had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. He was outperforming most of his guards as they loaded up the carts, and his efforts were exceeded only by Kristoff's tireless pace. Kristoff seemed to be running behind his cart as he passed other men on the dock, disappearing into the courtyard before returning for another load. Olaf helped where he could, but he mostly dashed and darted between the men, none of which paid him any attention now that their initial shock at seeing a magical snowman had worn off. As the sun dipped behind the fjord, it seemed like the ship's cargo holds would never empty, but the stream of men did slow, tapering off until there was only a trickle of workers making their way back and forth from the castle. Anna left to go find Kristoff, and Elsa took a seat on her throne, contemplating the day as a servant arrived to light the candles. How had things changed so rapidly, she wondered. She felt such a sense of relief, as if the world had been lifted off her shoulders. For the first time in many weeks she could face her people with pride and dignity, without being reminded of how much she was failing them. She knew she couldn't rely on the kindness of strangers to continue to provide for her people, though. Eventually they'd have to find a way out of this cursed drought, but until then they could enjoy a temporary reprieve from its effects. She wasn't sure how much time passed before Olaf came bounding through the archway. She could tell he'd enjoyed the day's activity. In fact, she imagined they all had. It was nice to have something to distract them from the perils of the drought. He hurried over and gave a bow. "Queen Elsa," he said with a tinge of excitement, "Prince John is here to see you." "What?" She was surprised by the news. What was John doing here? She hadn't expected to see him again today, but she was by no means going to refuse his company. She sat up straight, pulled her shoulders back, and smoothed out the wrinkles in her dress. "Yes, of course. Send him in." Olaf bounded out the archway, and a few moments later John entered the room, accompanied by 2 of her guards. They all stopped just inside the entrance. John looked like a different man from the one she'd met that morning. His hair was wet from what must have been a recent bath, and he was dressed in an outfit that made him look more like a commoner. A well-dressed commoner, to be sure, but it was a far cry from the prince's uniform she'd met him in. He wore a button-up shirt, dark blue with ruffles around the cuffs. His breeches were white and cinched with a black belt, and his boots were replaced by black shoes, each topped with a golden buckle. He held a roll of paper bound by a yellow ribbon, and when Elsa saw it, her heart skipped a beat. Was this the moment she'd discovered John's true motive? "Welcome," she said. "Thank you." Elsa waved him forward, and he approached, leaving the guards by the archway. He stopped a few paces before the throne. "I took the liberty of drawing a bath with some of the water we delivered. I couldn't bear the thought of being in your Majesty's presence smelling like a 3-day-old fish." Elsa smiled, trying not to appear uneasy, but she was nervous, and she wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was her doubt about John's motives. Whatever the case, she tried to conceal her apprehension behind the smile. "You would be welcome here regardless of your stench," she said, then flinched. She'd meant to put him at ease, not insult him. John, though, didn't seem to mind. He motioned toward a tall back chair set against the wall. "May I?" "Yes, of course." He grabbed the heavy chair and dragged it to the throne, its wooden legs sounding their defiance. He didn't sit beside her, though, giving the chair a quarter turn as if he meant to collaborate on some project. He sat down, adjusted his collar, then held out the roll of paper. Elsa didn't want to take it, but she did. She'd spent most of the day thinking how John's gift was too good to be true, and she was afraid this was the moment she'd find out she was right. "Thank you." It was more of a formality than an expression of gratitude, for she had no idea what the papers contained. She kept hearing the Duke's sneering voice as he said, "Sign these deeds over to me, and everything on my ship is yours." Whether John detected her doubts, she didn't know, but something moved him to announce their contents to her. "The ship's manifests," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Everything we delivered is in those papers." A wave of relief washed over her. She slid the ribbon off and unfolded the papers, holding them up to the candlelight. John watched with interest as she flipped from page to page, examining their contents. The first few pages listed only barrels of water, and as she scanned the pages, she tried to make a mental note of how many there were, but she lost count on the 3rd page. On the 5th and 6th pages were a variety of foodstuffs, cheeses, crackers, cured meats, and fruits and vegetables which wouldn't spoil quickly, such as apples and carrots. She smiled when she thought of Sven finally getting a taste of a carrot after going without for so long. He'd been one grumpy reindeer when his favorite snack was no longer available, putting on quite a pout and giving Kristoff the cold shoulder. Kristoff tried to appease him with other treats, even offering him items from his own rations, but Sven would have none of it. Eventually he got over it, but she knew Kristoff would be delighted to surprise him with a fresh carrot or 2. The next page contained tools and cleaning supplies, such as lye and scented soaps, along with things they'd need for basic repairs and upkeep of the castle. The last page, which only contained a few line items, were all of assorted wines. Elsa looked up, and her astonishment must have been obvious because John grinned. "This is incredible. This will last us for weeks." "Good," John said, resting his elbows on his knees. He laced his fingers together and became serious. "If it is within my power, I'll do whatever I can to help save Arendelle from this drought. But tell me, how bad is it?" She rolled the papers up and set them on the armrest of the throne. She hesitated, trying to decide how much to tell him. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like she could trust him, and yet she couldn't shake the words of warning Kristoff gave her. Was his the voice of reason? Was she being blinded by her own gratitude? I've never seen anything like it. When it first started early in the spring, we thought it was just a stretch of bad luck. But then all the water disappeared from everywhere. During the heat of the summer, things got really desperate, and we traded away almost everything of value just to get water and other provisions. Any resident who had somewhere to go fled, leaving behind the rest of the people to bear the brunt of the suffering. We've been searching the wilderness for water, but so far we've been unsuccessful. I don't know how much longer Arendelle would have lasted if you hadn't arrived." John nodded and leaned back, folding his hands behind his head. He was silent, his eyes straying to the ceiling before returning to Elsa. "And you have no idea what's causing it?" It was a question she didn't want to answer. She couldn't imagine telling this man she might be causing the drought. What would he think of her? Would he be revolted? Disgusted? John was watching her, but she was unable to meet his gaze. She felt like his eyes were burning through her, as if he could see right into her and detect the truths she didn't want to share. "No, none at all." John relaxed, leaning on the armrest. "Well, you've had to dwell on this tragedy for long enough. How about a little something to take your mind off the matter?" Elsa had no idea what he was talking about, but John gave a nod toward the archway. Olaf was waiting at the entrance with a strange man, one she didn't recognize. He was holding a small folded-up table in one hand and a wicker basket in the other. "May he enter?" Elsa hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, of course." John waved him over and he approached as bidden, setting the basket by his feet before unfolding the legs of the small table and placing it before them. He extracted a tablecloth from the basket, a red and white checkered napery which he draped over the table. He returned to the basket once more to produce a dark bottle and 2 silver goblets, setting them on the table. Then, without a word, he picked up the basket and followed Olaf out of the room. "How long has it been since you've had the taste of wine on your lips?" John asked, picking up the bottle. Elsa frowned. "How can I drink when my people are suffering?" She sat back in her throne and stared at the ceiling. She had no right to enjoy herself, she thought, not while her people were in such dire straits. "Elsa," John said, ignoring her protests as he uncorked the bottle of wine and poured some into her cup. "Your people are going to be fine." After filling hers, he poured some into his own, then squeezed the cork back into the bottle and set it on the floor. They sat in silence, and Elsa could feel his eyes upon her as if he were studying her. "Do you know what your problem is?" he asked after a moment of reflection. The question was a gentle one, without accusation, but she gave no response. "You spend so much time thinking about everyone else, you forget about yourself. Elsa, if you don't take care of yourself, how are you going to take care of your people?" There was a fundamental truth to his logic, she thought, a soundness of reasoning that struck her. It had nothing to do with the wine he was holding out to her. She just realized all her long days and sleepless nights were taking their toll. Of course, it was her responsibility to address the issues which brought her so much distress, but what he said made sense. If she didn't take time to renew herself, what good would she be to her people? Still, she hesitated, looking between the wine and John, but his eyes never wavered from hers as he waited. Eventually she took it, grabbing the cup by the stem and steadying it with her other hand. John picked up his own cup and held it aloft, waiting, and she responded by pressing the edge of her cup to his in a toast. She'd never done that before, never shared in a toast with anyone, and she found it to be a curious custom. It was odd for such a simple act to feel so strange, to be unsure about a tradition which most people took for granted, but here she was, awkwardly clinking cups with a prince she'd never met before today. John withdrew his cup and held it high. "To your people. May they forever be blessed with such a wise and beautiful queen." It was simultaneously exhilarating and awkward to be called beautiful by someone she'd just met, and she didn't know what to say or how to respond, so she hid behind her cup, raising it to her lips to take a drink. The wine was dark purple, and she was struck by the sweetness of its flavor, which was followed by a tang which made her jaws ache. She hadn't drank much wine, rarely getting the opportunity. In fact, the first time she ever tried it was at her coronation. As the newly installed queen, it was her duty to have the first drink of wine before everyone else would be served. She found it both bitter and sour, and she'd spent the next 20 minutes ruminating crackers trying to get the taste out of her mouth. She decided at that moment she didn't like wine and passed on the beverage at every other opportunity. But this was different. The flavor was sweet and the aroma pleasant, and the aftertaste which lingered on her lips seemed even better than her initial sip, so she took another. John was watching with eyebrows raised, waiting her judgment. "And? How is it?" "It's good." John smiled and they sat in quiet reflection, enjoying their drink together. But it didn't take long before her thought strayed toward Kristoff's warning. John seemed like a decent fellow, but there was that gnawing sensation in the back of her mind, a subtle prodding that she was making a mistake by becoming friends with this man whom she knew nothing about. She set her wine down and cleared her throat. "Kristoff doesn't think I should trust you." She was sure the statement sounded as abrupt as it felt, but she didn't know a subtle way to broach the subject. She waited for John's reaction, but it never came. He finished sipping his wine, then watched it swirl as he swished it around his cup. Finally, he put it down and looked up at her. "Is that your sister's fiancé?" Elsa nodded, and John paused, appearing to mull his words carefully. "Is he a good man?" Elsa was nervous again, and she put her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "She could never find anyone better. They deserve much more than what I can give them." "What do you mean?" "They just got engaged. It's the most important event in their lives, and I can't even celebrate it for them." "Because of the drought?" "Yes." John considered this, his eyes squinting and his lips pursing. "Well, I can't say that I blame this. Kristoff, was it?" Elsa nodded. John picked up his wine but didn't drink. He was staring at the wall as if lost in thought. Then his gaze returned to Elsa. "Arendelle has had a spot of bad luck with princes from the Southern Isles. I doubt I can say anything that will change his mind. Hopefully, my actions will speak for themselves." Elsa gave a slow nod and picked up her wine too, taking a sip. She looked over the rim at John before lowering her hands to her lap, her fingers playing over the surface of the cup as she nervously turned it round and round. "He wonders if there's even a Prince John of the Southern Isles at all." She wasn't able to meet John's gaze and sat staring at her goblet, her breath coming in short, nervous puffs which she tried to hide. John set his wine down again and studied her. She could feel his eyes upon her, probing her, probably trying to determine the seriousness of her doubts. She was lightheaded and her cheeks were warm, but she didn't know if it was the wine doing that or her own jittering emotions. She waited, not sure what to expect. An angry outburst, perhaps? However, when he spoke, he didn't sound angry at all. "No doubt your kingdom keeps records of all the royal birth announcements. Check your archives. Hopefully that will be enough to put your mind at rest." Of course! Why hadn't she thought of that? She'd spent the whole day brooding over Kristoff's words and trying to find a way to dispute his logic, and the answer was right under her nose the entire time. She'd received some of these announcements herself, official letters from neighboring kingdoms declaring the birth of some new prince or princess, but it never occurred to her to check her archives for such a thing. What a fool, she thought, to question his background without giving it due consideration first. She'd get Tobias to show her the royal archives and, "Oh my goodness," she said, putting a hand over her mouth. "Tobias!" Her wine went spilling out of her lap and crashed to the floor with a clank and a clatter. Long spikes of ice shot out from her throne, extending like the thorns of some vicious bramble. John leapt up in surprise, stumbling backwards and nearly tripping over his chair, spilling his own wine and sending it splashing across his legs. Olaf came bounding into the room, his eyes wide with concern, and the guards each took a step forward, their hands reaching for their swords as they searched for the source of the commotion. It only took them a moment to realize it was an accident, but they didn't immediately return to their stations, captivated by the throne which now had spikes of ice protruding from its edges. Elsa recoiled from her seat and stepped away from John, her hands rising to her mouth. She couldn't believe what she'd done. Her throne looked like some nightmarish device, the mangled production of an unstable artist. Tears of shame welled in her eyes. Then she saw the dark stains of purple that dappled John's lap. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry." John wore a look of shock. his eyes going from her to the throne and back again. She had no idea how he'd react, and she feared the worst. Had he been sitting a little to his right, he might have been impaled by one of the spikes, not to mention she'd ruined his breeches. Would he find her sudden lack of control infuriating? She once heard of a king in another land who had a servant executed for spilling wine on his new shoes. Was John that sort of man? Elsa was unable to move or speak, her hands covering her mouth as she waited for John's reaction. But she could never have anticipated what he did next. He looked down at his stained white breeches and threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't a scornful laugh, nor was it a nervous reaction to an uncomfortable situation. It was the deep, guttural sound of a man smitten by something so unexpectedly funny he can't control his own fits of hysteria. He wiped at his eyes, trying to gain control over his loud guffawing, but when he looked down at his legs again, he broke out in a fresh round of laughter. Elsa had no idea what to make of the situation. She knew he wasn't laughing at her, but she still felt terrible. "Well," John said, gaining control as he stooped to brush the remaining drops of wine from his lap, "that was quite the surprise." "I'm so sorry," Elsa said, horrified. John waved a hand at her as he sat back down. "It's quite all right. Fortunately, I travel with more than one change of clothes." He looked up from his stained outfit, and when he saw Elsa's distress, his smile faded. "Are you okay?" She wasn't okay. She'd ruined the evening, but even worse, she'd shown herself to be an unstable and dangerous woman. She didn't know what to say. She wanted to run back to her room and slam the door, shutting the world out and curling up on her bed to cry. John held out his arm, motioning for her to sit down. She looked at her throne like it was a poisonous snake and hesitated, not wanting to stay but knowing it'd be rude and a little childish to leave. After another moment of hesitation, she sat. "I'm so sorry. It's really nothing to worry about. I've done much worse to better clothes." He leaned over the side of his chair and snatched the goblets off the floor, setting them back on the table. "Are you okay?" "Yes, I'm all right." She tried to sound convincing. She saw the guards had returned to their posts, but Olaf was still standing there. "Olaf, please get a maid to clean this up." "Okay," he said, and went hopping out of the room. When she turned back to John, he was eyeing her with a look of concern. It was a strangely familiar look which reminded her of her father. When she was a child, her father would often visit her in her room, trying to help her learn to control the magic. When she lost control, which was more often than she cared to remember, he wouldn't get angry or become impatient. He'd simply brush the hair out of her eyes and look at her with an expression of sorrow and concern, the same look John was giving her now. "Clearly something has bothered you. I hope it wasn't anything I said." "No, of course not. I just realized I forgot about something important." "May I ask, does it have anything to do with me or my men?" "No, not really." "No, or not really?" Elsa watched the puddles of wine which crept toward one another, trying to merge into one large purple stain on the floor. She'd ruined everything, she thought, just when she was beginning to enjoy John's company, and now he probably couldn't wait to leave. "Would you like to get out of here? I'm certain you're dying to change out of those clothes." "As a matter of fact, I would like to get out of here, but the clothes can wait. A little wine never hurt anyone." He looked around the room. "You have a beautiful castle here, and I've only seen one hallway and the throne room. How about giving me the grand tour?" Elsa could hardly believe what he was asking, considering what she'd just done, and she kept waiting for a laugh or a smirk to betray the seriousness of his request. She expected him to excuse himself and retire to his room, telling his men about the close call he had had with the evil witch queen of Arendelle. But instead, he was sitting there, watching her, as if he really hoped she'd say yes. Did he really want to stay? He was perched on the edge of his seat, leaning forward with what looked like anticipation. He seemed like he'd sit there all evening if he had to, until he got the answer he was looking for, and she was surprised to find that made her happy and more than a little relieved. She stood up, undoing a clasp at her throat where a cape attached to her dress, and draped it over the back of the throne. "Very well. Follow me." She led him to the archway, and the guards there turned, preparing to follow. She waved a hand at them. "No, stay here, please." They returned to their posts, and Elsa left the throne room with John following close behind. She took him down the hallway to a set of stairs which led to the great hall, and then through an open door which led to another hallway. Eventually, they exited the castle into a large L-shaped courtyard filled with gardening plots which were bereft of life. In fact, there was little there to consider, the only items of interest being a few carcasses of once vibrant trees and a solitary bench which sat in the middle of a patch of brown, dying grass. It all looked pale in the soft light of the near full moon. "This used to be the rose garden," Elsa said, leading him to the bench across the way. They sat, him on one end, her on the other, with their knees pointing inward. She gave a look at one of the blackened trees which stood a few paces away. "Naturally, we couldn't maintain it, but I still come here sometimes when I want to be alone and think." There were no torches lit. She hadn't expected to be here and so hadn't sent a servant to ignite them, but it was far from dark. Her eyes went to the star-filled sky, and 1,000 dots of shimmering light winked back at her. "What startled you so much in the throne room?" His gaze was too intense, and she wasn't able to meet it, so she looked down at her hands. She'd just met this man and knew so little about him, so why did she feel like she could talk to him? Why did she feel comfortable answering his questions? "Just before you arrived, I commanded our last ship to go to our closest trading partner in Wesselton. Out of desperation, I agreed to trade Arendel's finest plots of land in exchange for a single ship of food and water." She looked up, and although John's gaze was no less intense, this time she didn't look away. "I got so worried when I saw your ships coming, I completely forgot to call it back. It must have left shortly after you arrived." The heat of tears burned behind her eyes, and she swallowed them back. How could she have been such a fool? How could she have forgotten to stop that ship? "I've made a terrible mistake." They sat in silence, and John withdrew his gaze. He was looking out over the courtyard, staring into the darkness, and after a moment of what she assumed was quiet contemplation, he spoke again. "Well, sounds as if I'm partially to blame." He sounded truly concerned, almost remorseful. She found it hard to believe that someone who barely knew her would be so invested in her plight. "In that case, tomorrow morning I'll send my fastest ship to Wesselton. You can write a letter invalidating the previous contract, and then you'll have nothing to worry about." "You would do that? For me?" "My dear Elsa, did I not say there was nothing I wouldn't do for Arendelle and its beautiful queen? That was twice in one evening he'd called her beautiful. How do you respond to that? What do you say?" It's not that she didn't like it, it was flattering, but it left her struggling for a response, and when she couldn't find one, she was glad to have the cover of darkness to conceal her unease. "But what are you going to do for your people?" John asked. She pried her thoughts away from his compliment, trying to understand his question. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the castle. "You have all these new supplies and provisions. Don't you think this would be the perfect time to celebrate your sister's engagement?" "Celebrate? At a time like this?" John pushed himself to his feet and held out his hand, palm up. He was waiting for something, but she didn't at first understand his intention. Then she realized he was waiting for her to take his hand, so she did. He gave a gentle pull and helped her to her feet, then placed her fingers in the crook of his elbow, leading her toward the large, wilted tree nearby. "Elsa," he said, looking up at the skeleton-like branches hanging above their heads. "You have to focus on the things you can control." He placed his hand on the gray, brittle skin of the tree, as if he were searching it for some sign of life. "When the drought causes your trees to wither and die, what can you do about it?" He waited for her answer, but he already knew the answer, she thought. If he hadn't known how helpless she felt, how hopeless she'd been, he wouldn't have come to Arendelle. "Nothing." "That's right, nothing. But when this drought causes the spirit of your people to wither and die, it's up to you, as their queen, to refresh it." There was a strange elegance to his words, an undeniable charm to their construction, and though she wanted to protest, to make the case for caution and concern, she found she couldn't refute his logic. In the end, she said nothing, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, and John didn't press the matter further. He turned toward the castle and offered his other elbow. "I think I've detained the Queen of Arendelle long enough for one evening. May I escort you back to your castle?" Elsa accepted the invitation and took his extended arm. His purple-stained breeches may have been a case for laughter in any other situation, but she barely noticed them. She was thinking about lost ships, regrettable contracts, and engagement celebrations. What John was thinking about, she had no idea, but after a moment, he led her away from the tree, and together they disappeared into the castle.